What I'd like to do is,
I'm not
consulting this morning.
Need to phrase it.
Our presenters are Michael Urban. I'm sorry. Michael Ivie. And Ed Longridge. I apologize, gentlemen. They're going to address FFC and CLM regulatory change and data governance adoption. With that said, welcome and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. We'll jump right in. I know we're going to be running a little bit late to lunch, given the timeline, but I think it's going to be worth it for this one today. So, Michael Ivie here, excited to meet everyone. Happy St. Patty's Day. 4 years ago when we rebranded as Biden, we picked green in anticipation of being here today. So, excited to talk to you about a topic near and dear to our heart that our goal in doing this today is to give you things and empower you to actually take it back to your organization, implement it, really drive change, or even conceptualize issues that I'm sure you're aware of, you feel them, and maybe just haven't been able to kind of pull them all together in an integrated way like we're going to show today. So really quickly, I'm the managing partner at Ivie Consulting, and I also have the privilege of leading our financial services practice, which is our largest and most differentiated practice at the firm. We are headquartered here in New York, but with offices in Tampa, Florida, Charlotte, Toronto, and London. So we are global, work with many of the largest financial institutions in the world. And so a lot of lessons learned, things that we incorporate into the things today. I also have the privilege of lecturing in the risk management and insurance management programs at Columbia and a couple other universities. So I always come with somewhat of a lecturing style or academic approach, married with real practical business things. It's very quickly on my background, because I think it's relevant to the topic today. And I started out my career before I was even 18 working in broker-dealer operations. And when I turned 18, excitedly submitted all my licensing and everything so that I could move to the business side. And then, fast forward a few years, and the 2008 financial crisis started, and it opened this opportunity for me to move into the world of risk management. And initially, I started in credit risk, and very quickly, and which was interesting at the time because credit risk, we didn't have Basel III, we didn't have SR 1110, we didn't have the FPO IHC rules, we didn't have a lot of the guidance today. Even then, Google searching things, you didn't find the unlimited free information that you can find today. So it was a very cool time to be moving into the world of risk management because we were really pioneering and innovating. Regulators were happy to come tell us what we needed to fix and by when we needed to fix it, but the how was something we were kind of left with to figure out on our own. And fast forward, worked through, did a lot of cool things there, but in the process, in my insatiable desire to attain more knowledge and learn, always sticking my nose in the other financial risk components of market, liquidity risk, and on the in-depth side. And so in doing all that, I accidentally found myself in a position where I was asked to create our enterprise risk management function and really tasked with breaking up the silos of risk across the organization and to aggregate risk data and drive reporting from a risk perspective across the organization. So started off, dove in head first, focused on policies and procedures, and very quickly realized there were tons of contradictions, lots of issues, lots of gaps. And then I realized that that's not even my biggest issue. My biggest issue is really going to be the data and tackling that. It was just brilliant timing because also in 2012 at the time, what came about was BCBS 239, Basel Community Banking Supervision's Principles for Effective Risk Data Aggregation Risk Reporting. And it was perfect, it was exactly what I needed. But then to get the data right, I very quickly realized you have to have that connection to the business and the processes. And so it was cool because it brought my career full circle back to ops, business, through risk, through data, and back again. So with that, we're going to talk about a lot of interesting things. I'm going to let Ed introduce himself, and he's going to talk about the regulatory landscape to kind of set up this data conversation.
Yeah, so hi, good morning everyone, nice to be here. So I started off in London, grew up in England, got in really at the beginning around 2000, 2001, it's sort of the early, particularly in Britain, the early onsets of AMLA rules and regulations. I worked for Smith Barney, so I'm dating myself a little bit. We were still sort of Smith Barney and not entirely City Group at the time. But started off in the wire room in our broker-dealer in London and investigating, like many other people in other British banks, the inflow influx of Russian money from Russian oligarchs coming into the financial system in the UK. Fast forward, it's amazing how the world's come full circle, right? So from there, headed up client onboarding Morgan Stanley in London, across Europe, and then 2007 moved to Deutsche in New York, Deutsche Bank New York, and then to Citi. Ultimately, my in-house career culminated as the lucky gentleman to walk into Oppenheimer & Co. Inc. About 6 weeks after the settlement of an SEC and FinCEN enforcement action into AML and whatnot to do with penny stock. So that was in 2015, and then went consulting, crossed over the outside of the street in 2018. So and joined more recently, the end of last year, to head up the financial crimes practice here at Phyton. And very happy to be with you today. We've got an exciting view of European, US financial crimes regulations dating back over the last 20 years, coupled with how we integrate with data.
There's a couple slides in here the slides will be available for you to download. So there's some information on Phyton in there. We are subject matter led, execution focused. We're very differentiated in how we approach things. But as I mentioned, I'll be speaking on data in the later half. But Ed, if you want to take it away.
So we want to start off with giving you the regulatory sort of time frame. The first couple of slides. So looking at last year really was a hugely influential moment in US AML regulatory rulemaking. Of course, starting off with the AMLA and CTA as part of the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. The beginning of the year, it passed through Congress last December 2020. Of course, we had the ANPRM that came out on beneficial ownership reporting requirements in April. All importantly, in June, we had the FinCEN issuing the national priorities. I thought we had great sessions this morning going through those priorities in detail. In Europe, meanwhile, we had the 60 EU implementation date halfway through the year. And then, of course, I think we all remember what happened in December when we were all anticipating some of the rulemaking that was going to come from FinCEN on the AMLA. But there was sort of a 10-day period at the beginning of December where, the US regulators literally lit up in that sense. And FinCEN just issued rule after rule, and I was in the middle of actually writing a white paper and going back and changing it. Sort of every 5 minutes as another rule comes out, so a proposed rule comes out. But we have there, of course, the NPRM on beneficial ownership reporting requirements, the review of BSA regulations and guidance. What's really interesting is the AML regulations, the NPRM around real estate transactions, and I think that's, perhaps we can talk a little bit about that in terms of how that's going to get coupled into also the CTA requirements and how the US government's really will be targeting real estate and the money laundering that's happened in this country for many, many years through real estate. And then finally, we've got human trafficking coming from the White House, and also anti-corruption. So if we go back, and as we saw this morning, if we go back over a longer period of time, over the last 20 years, of course in 2001 we had the USA Patriot Act, and we can draw a parallel here between sort of the EU anti-money laundering directives, the third EU coming out in 2005, but really since then, between 2005 and 2015, it was pretty quiet in terms of both European and US rulemaking and large-scale AML legislation. And then suddenly in 2015, the world wakes up, right? We have the fourth EU anti-money laundering directive. We have the CDD rule in 2016, the implementation of the fourth EU in 17, the CDD rule implementation in 18, the fifth EU in 18, the 6 EU just about 6 months later at the end of 2020. We have the implementation of 5th EU, and of course right at the end of the year, lapping over into to 2021, of course, is the NDAA, of course, containing the AMLA. And of course, 2021, as we saw on the last slide, we have a lot of rulemaking associated with that. What this is really showing is that international regulators have really woken up in the last 6 or 7 years, and we have a whole stream, of course, as we've all lived and breathed over the last few years, of new requirements, new pressures on our organizations to implement. If we look more closely at the regulatory landscape, we can see, and we can sort of pick out a few things. You'll see a lot of similarities, particularly between EU AML requirements and US AML requirements, and of course as well Australian requirements too. There's no great surprise here. Of course, everyone's part of the FATF, right? Both if you're an EU member state, UK, United States, Australia, and of course we're all following those FATF recommendations. But to pick out some of the similarities, right? So CDD rule in the United States in 2016, of course, when the final rule was released by FinCEN in 2016, on beneficial ownership, it did have that 2-year implementation phase to 2018. If you look over to the right, you've got beneficial ownership, which built on the beneficial ownership requirements of the 3rd EU, but coming up again in the 4th EU. Again, in the 5th EU, you have the inclusion of cryptocurrencies within the existing European AML framework. Of course, cut across to the AMLA in 2020, we have the inclusion of virtual currencies. And it was, obviously there's going to be a lot of movement, I believe, this year when it comes to the frameworks around the AML framework, regulatory requirements around cryptocurrencies over the next 12 months. What we're seeing here is, from a regulatory perspective, over the last few years, of course, that there has been a harmonization, a network, a framework of rulemaking that is incredibly similar. It's almost like a global regulatory approach behind the scenes to fight financial crime, to combat human trafficking. So, looking more closely, in 2022, of course, we have the AMLA and its requirements. Earlier this year, the OCC said that they want their examiners to start assessing and evaluating how US banks' change management programs are adapting and evolving towards the requirements of the AMLA, right? And so they expect their examiners to start having those conversations about how are you gearing up your change management functions to build and to drive your programs towards those requirements. I think that's a critical sort of, in a way, warning shot across the bows for banks in this country that there is going to be an expectation that we start moving now, right? And we'll be examined against that. Of course, the idea is that we take the requirements of the AMLA, most notably, I think, most impactfully, the national priorities that we know about. They're exceptionally broad and wide in scope. It's going to be very interesting to see how regulators actually examine the compliance of the national priorities when it comes to it. But driving those through your change management functions and ultimately building out an efficient and effective financial crimes program. In terms of the change management function itself, I think it's critically important, first of all, in terms of planning for change, as sort of step one, having that key stakeholder buy-in from the top of the house. You need to have all of your, across your entire financial institution, all divisions, all groups involved, be it compliance, the business, operations, technology, that they all have to have, you know, a key integral plot to play as part of the change management function. So planning for that phase is you know, critical, because ultimately if you don't have that strategic planning across your organization with the right level of communication, your change management functions ultimately will fail. Managing that change in terms of phase 2 is also very important. You know, when I've implemented, you know, change programs across financial institutions, the one thing that we always anticipate at the beginning is it's going to take X number of months to do something, whether it's implementing a new platform, changing a program framework, and quite often you end up doubling that time scale. And so build in that time and get ahead of it. And of course, ultimately, you can build out what looks to be, hopefully, this type of illustration, with this illustration here, of an efficient and effective program framework. I think if we look at this, fundamentally, your data management organization, your data management program has to be completely integrated with your financial crimes program. And that comes from the foundations you see along the bottom of governance, quality, analytics, lineage, mapping, integration, through all of your technology platforms. You have to really, truly understand and know your data. Within that, of course, in your core, you have to have good model risk management programs, because if you start looking at these columns, client lifecycle management, sanctions and name screening, which is obviously hugely topical right now, and another huge stress with Russian, Belarusian sanctions, your transaction monitoring investigations. If these 3 columns have any pressure points and they don't have good data management, then essentially they're going to topple over. So to give you a case in point, understanding your data, peeling the onion of beneficial ownership to understand whether you've got a Russian sanctioned individual or organization, going through from sanction screening. If you have bad data or incorrect data, let's put it that way, or incomplete data, you're never going to be able to truly understand who your customers are. So that data management and model risk management are really a key component of your framework. So let me pass it over now to you, Michael, and you can
Switch spots with you. Thanks, Ed. So I think we've all seen the iceberg illustrations before, where you see the tip of the iceberg sticking above, and then you have no clue how big the ice, the majority of the mass, is actually under the water. And so our point of view is essentially that you have to pay attention to the tip of the iceberg, and essentially the regulatory landscape today is that tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot we need to focus on. But if you just tackle that tip and start chipping away there, you're missing everything else below the surface, and we think data management is a big part of that. So there is a data management track later today, so I don't want to steal too much thunder of it. Obviously, boiling the ocean on data management is a good way to melt an iceberg, but I don't think it's going to solve our problem here. When we think about data management, we have a capability framework that has these 7 key pillars to it. There's a lot of data capability frameworks that are standard industry frameworks, like the EDM Council has their DCAM framework, Carnegie Mellon has one, DAMA, the Data Management Association, has one. And they all vary a little bit, but essentially we all talk about the same things in our frameworks. But one common thing that exists in every data management framework is always data governance. And so we're going to focus a lot today on the data governance operating model and how we tackle that, hopefully in a way you haven't seen it done, because you oftentimes probably, if you're at a large, complex organization, you already have a data management office, you have a data governance function, and they're probably not doing a lot to actually help you guys out. And so hopefully we can kind of shine a light on that. And again, the slides will be shared, so we don't have to go through and share all this now. But so for the data governance operating model, there's a few key pillars. And again, if you just tackle all of it, you're probably going to be overwhelmed and struggle. So how do we really focus on building the foundation? It's great if your organization does have an enterprise data governance, data management function, but oftentimes those are focused on the regulatory imperatives. right? So I mentioned BCBS 239 earlier. And so what that means is what the organizations typically do is they take their critical reports, whether it's their regulatory reports, the Y9C, the 14A, they decompose those reports and the elements in those reports to figure out what are the atomic elements that ultimately get aggregated or go into calculations that feed into those reports. And they say, okay, well, let's figure out what those critical data elements are, and then let's put a lot of governance in place around those. And so as you do that decomposition from those reports, you've got these tentacles reaching back towards the front office. But as you reach back to the client, ultimately, and the origination of all this data, the tentacles get thinner and thinner and gaps start to kind of appear. So you're not really getting business-driven coverage of the data. You're getting regulatory reporting, which obviously big imperative, big risk for the organization. So it's a fine place to start and establish a foundational program. But then how do we pivot from that and continue to iteratively evolve our data governance program to actually drive value for the business, to improve the customer experience? It's amazing that so many data management programs just seem to completely ignore that aspect of this of the effort. So for those of you that may, I don't know, by show of hands, does anyone have that frustration where they feel like data management, data governance isn't there to really help them improve their data? So, okay, so obviously it's a big problem for those of us that actually work in client onboarding, account opening, anywhere in the client lifecycle. Inevitably, some of those tentacles make it back there, and you have some representation, some coverage, but it's never going to really help you solve any of your problems. And so what actually ends up happening is the business ends up funding it because it's supposed to be business driven. Business funds the initiatives and like, well, where's the ROI for me? And so over time, you have that hype cycle where everybody's investing in data management, and then because there's not business value coming from it, it starts to fade off a little bit, right? So then you have less and less resources in that data function, and you're essentially back where you started with better reg reporting maybe, but so how do we tackle it from a front office standpoint? Well, you need good executive sponsorship, of course. I think we all know that, but we need to drive client data governance. The way we do that, hopefully we can do it in partnership with the central data office if it exists in your organization. But otherwise, we need to kind of focus on what are the pillars underpinning data governance. So some of the organization components and the operating processes, kind of like I talked about that full circle earlier, those are great places to really start. Obviously, policies and standards and metrics are critical too. Hopefully those are outcomes as you iteratively mature the first two pillars, you can kind of get to those. But really, if you focus on organization, how you do information governance, assigning your data owners and stewards and their roles and responsibilities and things like that, that's all important there. On the process side, having those owners and stewards actually touching the processes, which we're going to talk more about the process side, because I think that's the key to a lot of this stuff and how we do this bottom-up, customer-centric approach. All that ultimately leads us back to a more integrated, cross-functional view of the organization and an ability to actually move the needle and empower the business from a data standpoint. And so there's a lot here. I'm just going to summarize it for you. So I mentioned processes, right? So what I've illustrated here is a representative functional model for the client lifecycle. So you have client and sales management, for example, which is comprised of some level 2 and level 3 activities like client onboarding, client profiling, client reporting, sales and marketing, and some other key functions. And so you have tons of stuff going on here, interactions between all the different levels here, lots of data being created, stored, and consumed across all these processes. Again, the organization's looking for critical data from a regulatory standpoint. And so they land on a couple pieces of data here, but they're not really taking a lot of it. Shocks me too that a lot of banks don't even have a functional model where they can say, this is our client lifecycle, and these are the process steps that exist in that lifecycle and that flow. So sometimes you have to kind of even start there and mine out those processes and put together documentation. And I hate process documentation for the sake of process documentation, as probably all of us in this room do. But there is real value that comes from it. And by looking at the processes, we're able to then look at the data that is, again, created, stored, or consumed downstream that originates in these processes. And so from here, we can take a bottom-up approach to identifying data that we can then bring under governance. And so a lot of times, your data governance office isn't going to want to take this approach to kind of get your voice heard and then also a lot of times they don't understand the client lifecycle function as well. So they don't have the perspective of how they can really drive improvements in the client lifecycle. So that's the premise of this. We can go much deeper into this topic, but starting with that functional model for your organization. And ultimately, you want to come up with a target operating model. And the number of times I talk to heads of client lifecycle management and things like that, well, what's your operating model? Do you have it defined? Like, yeah, we do, here it is. And it's an org chart. Org chart is not an operating model. And so I think that kind of confusion point there also creates a lot of issues for organizations. And just some additional context on what the data office is doing with a lot of that critical data. They do there's a lot of different ways to do data certification, but data certification essentially consists of a few different things that do create business value, but you gotta make sure you have the right data getting certified if you wanted to create that value for you. So defining the data, a lot of organizations think they have a data dictionary, but it's technology and system driven, it's not business driven. And it's interesting, everybody thinks it's gonna be an easy exercise getting a business glossary built out, and they say, well, what is a counterparty ID? Like, well, obviously it's this. Well, no, that's not what it is to me. That's not what it is to me. So the effort it takes in some cases to start to kind of build up that savvy with your data owners and stewards so that you can actually have proper business-driven meaning of your data is actually a bigger undertaking than many realize. Traceability of your data, just knowing back to front the flow of the data. You don't have to do it at a technical level every single time down to the attribute or element. But if an organization says we don't want to even do conceptual level, you're telling me conceptually you don't even know where your critical data is coming from and where it's going, or you don't even know what your critical data actually is. You don't have that documented somewhere. Like, those things are usually big red flags that should kind of shock us, I would think. And then things like profiling your data. Business controls is a huge one, making sure you have the right technical business and operational controls in place around that critical data so that you can actually prevent a lot of issues that end up causing losses for the bank or just issues downstream that require a lot of effort and manpower to remediate. And then of course your ongoing monitoring. Once you've gone through this exercise, that upfront exercise of onboarding your critical data, getting through all these steps, and then you just have to maintain it over time. So that's a typical certification framework, whether it's the regulatory decomposition or the process-driven approach to identifying that critical data, it all kind of works the same. And to wrap up here quickly, we're talking about a journey here, so it's not like this is just a 2-year project and then you're done. We do want to transition to somewhat of a BAU state at some point, but in this change phase, it's really important that we break down the problem that we have, the challenge that we have, into digestible chunks. And so usually, we talk about business initiatives, those process up initiatives, regulatory initiatives, which is almost always the focus these days, driving some critical data, but then also partnering with the data office, if you have one, to understand, well, what are their imperatives from a data management strategy or just data management best practices. So from those 3 different purviews, you can kind of balance and figure out, well, what's a good pilot program? What are some proof of concepts where we can get quick wins and start to drive that value for the organization? And then over time, as you work your way through that, you can then expand that scope more and more and improve your competency and your controls around your data. And then you can start to bring in actual cases and scenarios where we say, okay, we've got better control of some of our critical client data. Now, how can we take that knowledge and that power and start to tackle head on some of our other client related issues, like the client experience, client lifecycle, client onboarding, which, given that tip of the iceberg of the regulatory landscape today, it's really important that we have the data power underneath so that we can kind of get through some of those things. So that's it for now. Do we have a minute for questions?
Couple questions.
Cool.
Really, really great.
Thank you.
I like the idea that you reinforced the importance of data in the management of it. With that said, what if some organizations do not have a formal data management program built on? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I kind of alluded, some of your organizations may have one, some don't. You may find that even if you do have one, they're not willing to kind of hear your demands here. There are some really good business cases that you can create, but ultimately that's what it comes back to, is trying to create that business case. And unfortunately, I don't have the panacea for doing that and getting buy-in, getting funding. Ultimately, you need a person that understands data management, data governance at the top of the house that can really advocate and push it. So it's an uphill battle though, you know, like the guy pushing the rock up the hill, it's an uphill battle if you're just trying to solve for that yourself, without that executive advocacy going on. But inevitably, if you don't tackle these challenges, you are gonna get a carrot or a stick at some point. So like last year, a handful of prominent family funds like Archegos and Greensill and things like that blew up, and there were tens of billions of dollars of losses that some of the most prestigious investment banks in the world ended up having taken. It all happened in a couple days. And so that's a great business case. Even some of those banks that were impacted, we kind of presented this a couple of years ago, and then as soon as that starts happening, they're like, okay, well maybe we did need to do some of those things and understand our client data so that we can then empower better client profiling, risk and return on your clients, so that, you know, the RAROC and some of the CCAR things are again focused on the regulatory outcome and how it gets reported, but sometimes we lose sight of how that drives our business decisions. So ultimately, you've got to get the executive sponsorship, you've got to get their buy-in, and you've got to have the business case as well.
I think it's important that if you don't have those out.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
And I think, this is the second question, an opinion. In your opinion, what are the most impactful elements of the AMLA for financial institutions?
I think ultimately, and obviously the sort of requirements of the AMLA and everything is somewhat of a work in progress, and we'll see how that sort of develops this year. But from what we know so far, I think, look, we had great sessions this morning around sort of the national priorities. I think that's going to be a key of how financial institutions really address those national priorities within their financial crimes programs, and largely through your risk assessment, right, of how you evaluate. But most importantly, I think what Sabina this morning was saying, you know, the importance of documentation, you know, and I having sat across the, you know, conferences with regulators and indeed across the table from them, it's like if you don't document, it doesn't exist, right? So it's document. If, for example, one national priority, for example, doesn't apply to your organization, that's okay, but your documentation has to be robust with a clear argument for why not, right? I think a couple of other areas, one would be the ability, and we saw this morning as well, the ability to share SAR information within foreign branches of your organization affiliates, excluding Russia and China. I think that's going to be a great eye-opener. I remember when I was in-house of having, if I had known that they'd filed the SAR in Europe and, you know, I saw this activity in the United States, we would never have opened the account, right? So that's going to be key. And then finally, I think again, that came up this morning, in one of the panels this morning, is the ability for essentially the US government to subpoena correspondent bank relationships and obtain not just information about the correspondent banking relationship itself, but any type of account held at that correspondent bank. That's a huge eye-opener, and we're really beginning to see kind of the advance of US regulators setting the pace across sort of other countries. And so it's going to be really interesting. I think we saw it this morning as well. It's going to be interesting to see how other countries actually react to that. And that's one of those requirements in the AMLA that's kind of slid under the radar, perhaps a little intentionally, but it's right there, and it's going to have a huge impact.
Well, Michael, Ed, I want to thank both of you for wonderful